All right, it looks like we're ready to start. So I wanted to go ahead and greet everyone and thank you so much for joining us. This is a live recording of the workshop exploring the history of Appalachia, a conversation with Dr. Richard Straw. Like I said, this workshop is being recorded, so if you have friends that miss it and have questions, feel free to reach out to us at OMSAR and we'll be happy to help you out there. So we in the Division of Diversity and Inclusion are excited to have you join us this afternoon. My name is Claire Garner, and I'm a graduate assistant in the Office for Multicultural Student Access and Retention. My position works with programming for our Appalachian and would-be commuter students. And for those of you who are new to the term Appalachian, in this context, it's referring to a 13-state designation that spans from New York to Mississippi. So being from Appalachia myself, I'm thankful for the opportunity to learn from Dr. Richard Straw and his presentation for this evening.
So I'm Richard Straw, and just as a way of minor introduction, because I'm actually going to tell you a little bit about who I am in my talk. But I grew up in Athens, went to OU, got my bachelor's and master's at OU, and I left in 1972 and went to the University of Missouri, where I got a PhD in history, and bounced around a number of different jobs. And then I came back and lived in Athens for another 2 years, well, about a year and a half, 75, part of 75 and 76. And then I left for good in January of 1977. And have maintained really strong ties with Athens. I still have friends there and visit probably 4 or 5 times a year. Keep up with high school friends on Facebook and that sort of thing. And my training is actually, my PhD work is actually in the history of the South. And I sort of saw an opportunity to combine some things and got interested in Appalachia really as a senior in high school, honestly. And then really pursued that in graduate school, not in terms of coursework, because there really wasn't anything like that then, but in terms of research interests and that sort of thing. And my dissertation was about the biracial nature of the United Mine Workers Union, but focused on Alabama, technically not in Appalachia. And then I taught at Davis and Elkins College in West Virginia for a little bit, and I was actually the director of their Appalachian Studies program, which sounds a lot more important than it actually was. There were just two of us there. And then I taught also at Williams College in Massachusetts, and then landed here in Radford, Virginia in 1981. Is Gigi back? Her name's on the screen. Should I just keep going?
Keep going, Dr. Straw.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're good. Okay, so when Chris contacted me to ask me if I would be willing to participate in this program, we spent some time talking about Athens, because she had seen my book, Shameless Commerce here. She had seen my book about Athens and was interested in it. And so we figured out maybe that I could talk a little bit about Athens and then connect Athens to Appalachia and talk about the two of those things together, maybe how they come together in some ways. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And the focus, my focus today, when I teach in all my classes, I always tell my students that any knowledge that exists in any field at all started with a question. So I always ask a lot of questions in my class, and I try to have one big question at the beginning of each class. So the question for today is, where are you from? That's the question. Where are you from? That's a question that we've all been asked a lot in our lives. If you travel, I've been overseas many, many times. You meet people, you talk to people. It's a natural question. Where are you from? So the subtitle of my book, another shameless commerce plug here, my book on Appalachia is called High Mountains Rising, and the subtitle is Appalachia in Time and Place. So I'm really going to focus on the idea of place today. So Athens, Ohio, was and is what I would call my place. And I've reflected on that quite a lot, actually, particularly since I haven't lived in Athens since 1976, which is before many, many of you probably were born. So why is Athens still my place? And it's because Athens has a hold on me. What hold places have on us is something that I'm really, really interested in. And I read a lot of other books about place. Why do we react so strongly to certain places? Why do people go to certain places and they have an immediate positive or negative reaction to where they are? So in talking about Athens, I thought I would show some of the pictures from the book. So Dwayne is going to just put some pictures up here, and I'm going to talk over the photographs. So I grew up in Athens in the, well, I was really sort of conscious of things in Athens in the, from the mid 1950s through the 60s and into the early 70s. I graduated from Athens High School in 1967. And this actually, if you could hold this picture on there for a second, Dwayne, this is a photograph that many of you are probably familiar with. This is the building today at the corner of West Washington Street and Schaefer Street. Today it houses, I think they call it the West End Cider House. And I and my brothers grew up just up the street from this building. And this building is a really good example of the kind of businesses that were in Athens in this period of time. Athens was more than Ohio University. When I go back to Athens today, I'm just struck by the fact that that the university just permeates the entire community in a way that it really never did, that I don't remember it at all doing growing up, even after I became a student at OU. Athens was in the early half of the 20th century. You can change that now, Dwayne. In the early half of the 20th century, Athens was a very industrial city. It was a working class city. It was a center of coal mining activity. The coal trains went through every day. We grew up right by the railroad tracks, and the railroad was a very, very important part of the community. There was a brick making facility there that you'll see a picture of right here. There were building materials produced there. Later in the middle of the 20th century, the McBee Office Machines Company, which was a Fortune 500 company, had its headquarters in Athens. And into the 1960s, McBee was the largest employer in Athens. There were actually automobiles produced in Athens. A small company called Midget Motors produced a car called a King Midget. It was a 1 horsepower gasoline motored car. And Athens was also a center of farming and agriculture. So when I was growing up, the point that I'm trying to make is that Athens was a place that was really very diverse. Its economy was very diverse. and the people that lived there were diverse as well. One of the things that I do recall about Athens, though, that I think people of my generation would relate to, is that it was really a city of neighborhoods. It was a city where neighborhoods dominated life. There were neighborhood groceries all over, neighborhood churches. It was really a community of neighborhoods. And even as a kid, I can remember growing up on West Washington Street. If we went over the hill by the cemetery and went down onto Union Street, that was a different neighborhood, and it was a different feel, and the people in the stores didn't know who you were. If I went down into the east end of town, particularly after I got into high school, junior high and high school, sometimes it was a little bit uncomfortable to be in other parts of town because people didn't know who you were. So later on in high school, I got my awareness of Athens as a city in a region expanded. And when I was a senior in high school, I started hanging out at the university. I was dating a freshman at OU when I was a senior. And I used to go to this coffee house called the Cellar Door. And it was originally, it was in the basement of the Episcopal Church there on the University Terrace. And I remember there was a band there that played kind of a jug band type outfit. And they called themselves the Millfield Colliery and 1935 Mining Disaster Jug Band. Long name for a band. Those guys really piqued my interest because I figured if they knew about this mining disaster that had happened out at Millfield in 1935, that was probably something that I should know about. So I started getting interested in some of the history of the area around Athens, actually. And it became the thing to do among a certain type of person, I guess, that was in high school and at OU. It kind of became the thing to do to get in our cars and to go out exploring. And we started going out to places like Millfield and Chansey and up to places like Buckle and Gloucester, and even farther afield, even up into Morgan County, down into Meigs County, just exploring the region. And it was this period of time when some students began to move out of town, and move out into the country. And we started exploring these coal towns and these communities around Athens. Some of us started going to the towny bars. I don't think there are really any towny bars left in Athens, but in the 60s and really up through the mid 70s at least, there were bars that were in some of the neighborhoods, and they weren't places where students went. And so some of us began to go to some of those. So all of this just kind of saying that I was sort of broadening my perspective, and then I got into OU in the history department and started getting interested in started becoming friends with some other people that were interested in Appalachia. And in the late 1960s, there's this kind of burgeoning interest in scholarly work, scholarly research in Appalachia. Most of it at that time was done by anthropologists and sociologists and people studying Appalachian literature. There really wasn't a field called Appalachian history. So kind of making a transition to talking about Appalachia, in my Appalachian history course, which I've taught for about 40 years now, in that class, I opened that class with two questions. And one of the questions is, where is Appalachia? And the other question is, what is Appalachia? And for a lot of people, or for me in particular, what is Appalachia is an easier question to answer than where is Appalachia. where is Appalachia can be a strictly geographical question. And, we can talk about the mountains and the valleys and the plateaus and that sort of thing. But defining the region strictly in a geographic sense is pretty hard. And I don't really get too much into that, because if you start talking about geography, then you start talking about culture really, really quickly. So we can define Appalachia, and what I do in my course is, how do we define Appalachia? And we can define it in a number of different ways. It's a place with a shared geography. Possibly it's a place with a shared culture. Possibly it's a place with a shared history. Possibly it's a place with a shared economic structure. All of those explanations of Appalachia are legitimate, and people have done a good deal of research and writing in all of those areas. To me, though, because of the difficulties of defining the region, to me, I've been more influenced by people who have written about and talk about Appalachia, not so much as a place, but more as an idea. And a book that just absolutely floored me when it came out, and I still think it's one of the best books written about Appalachia, is a book called, if you can see that, it's called Appalachia on Our Mind. And it's by Henry Shapiro. And it came out in 1978, and Shapiro was a historian at the University of Cincinnati. And it's an extraordinary book, because what he does is he really talks about how this place that we call Appalachia, he talks about how this place has resonated as a part of American history, and that through the years, it's served a function. It's provided a need. It's satisfied something that the larger consciousness of America has needed. And actually, I think that we're kind of flirting with some of those ideas even today. So to me, Appalachia as an idea has been a lot more important than worrying about Appalachian history, let's say, or geography or those sorts of things. So if we look at this idea of Appalachia or if we look at Appalachia as an idea, there's a lot of different things that come up. One is that Appalachia has served historically as what Shapiro calls America's alter ego. That at times when the United States has been going through dramatic changes of one sort or another, people have looked to Appalachia as a place where change has not occurred. This is particularly powerful idea in the period of time about the 1870s or so into the early years of the 20th century. You have titles of magazine articles and titles of books written in that period of time, like The Land Where Time Stood Still, and A Strange Land Inhabited by Peculiar People. And even as late as the early 1960s, I forget the author's name, very influential book at that time was called Yesterday's People. So this notion that Appalachia was this place, where things didn't change, has had a powerful influence on America's thinking about this place called Appalachia. And a good deal of historical writing, Ron Eller, for example, recently retired from the University of Kentucky's history department. He was the director of the Appalachian Center there for a long time. He basically spent his whole career researching and writing about how Appalachia has not been unique, that in fact you can understand American history better by looking at Appalachia. And so rather than it being this exception, it's actually a mirror of the changes that have taken place in the country itself. Another aspect of this notion of Appalachia as an idea has to do with the perception of Appalachia as an overwhelmingly rural area. And so the pastoral image of Appalachia as a rural part of the country that's not been urbanized, that's not been industrialized. This was a very, very, very powerful image of Appalachia, again, that comes out of this period in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when in fact Appalachia was experiencing industrialization, immigration, urbanization on a smaller scale, but still coal towns of 10 or 15 or 20,000 people provided a completely different lifestyle for rural people, European immigrants who came to America to work in these coal fields. So the pastoral and rural image of Appalachia is something else that's been a really enduring image. It's also been seen as kind of the repository of what Theodore Roosevelt called the true American culture. The idea that Appalachia, again, is this place that hasn't changed. This became a very, very, very important idea, again, right around the turn of the last century, 1890s, early 1900s, as America was receiving waves and waves and waves of European immigrants, of people from Sicily and Russia and Poland and the Ukraine, Catholics and Jews pouring in over 1 million a year. As America is changing, urbanizing, industrializing, people began to look at Appalachia as a place where it's the repository of this sort of pure Anglo-Saxon culture. So you have folklorists and people like Cecil Sharp from Britain and other folklorists coming into Appalachia, looking for songs, looking for stories, looking for folk tales, looking for basically evidence, that this is a kind of a repository of this pure American culture. And of course, there's an enormous amount of nativism and racism that's a part of that. Early folk festivals that were held in Appalachia wouldn't allow any music that they deemed to have come from African American sources. As much as people associate the banjo, for example, with Appalachia, the White Top Folk Festival, which was begun in the early 1930s, they barred banjo music because it was associated with blacks. So that's a really interesting history there of itself, this idea that this is sort of the true American folk music. There's a really very accurate movie called The Songcatcher that deals with a lot of these questions about people coming in from the outside, mining the region for its cultural heritage, and then leaving. So that's all kind of wrapped up together. Appalachia was seen as the first frontier, which is also a really important part of its history. It was a seedbed of weird and strange people, innocent, naive people. It's the favorite topic of the local color writers that were looking for unusual people and picturesque places in the late 19th century. There were more short stories and novels written about Appalachia between 1880 and 1900 than any other part of the country. Stories by people like John Fox Jr., The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come, and these were read by people all over the United States. And they give this idea of Appalachia as the isolated part of the United States. And I'll just tell one quick anecdote here. My family, my mother, her people were from Eastern Tennessee and Kentucky, and she loved the Southern mountains, and we would go down. We went to the Smokies a couple of times on trips. And I have a very, very distinct memory of we were probably on the Blue Ridge Parkway at an overlook, and my mom pointing out that you could see a little swirl of smoke coming up over there in the hills somewhere, and my mom commenting something about those people being so isolated, and they probably don't even know who's the president of the United States or anything like that. So, those ideas were really, really powerful and implanted in people's minds. So, to me, what distinguishes Appalachia as a place is this idea of place. And this is something that I find resonates among young people today from Appalachia that I teach. A lot of students at Radford are first generation. A lot of them are from Southwestern Virginia. And they have a love of the place where they grew up. They feel a sense of belonging there. They understand the roots that their families have there. And to know a single place, that you came from is still a powerful, powerful emotion or sentiment that young people in Appalachia today have. People know the place names of where they're from. They know the hills and the valleys. They know the names of the streams. They know the names of the families that live up the road, that live over the hill. They know the reputations of the local families. I always get a laugh out of my students because my girlfriend, in my first girlfriend in college, she was from her family was from West Virginia, and her mom would always say, you don't want to be like the Higginses. And they were just the family that had a bad reputation. And like everybody knows a family in their area that has a bad reputation. And you don't want to be like those people. Something else that really resonates with my students when I talk about Appalachian culture today is home building patterns. If you drive around in Appalachia, you drive around in Southwestern Virginia and other parts of Appalachia today, and you see an older home, and then you see a newer home pretty close by. Maybe you see a mobile home or two pretty close by also. Chances are the people that live in all those houses are related. They want to live still in these family enclaves, and if they can't do that, they want to live very, very, very close, as close as they can. Young people from Appalachia today also have a real challenge when it comes to leaving home. One of the very best students that I have ever taught was brilliant enough easily to have gotten a PhD in history, but he didn't want to. Well, he wanted to, but he couldn't leave this area. He was from Floyd County, Virginia, and he didn't want to leave. And Virginia Tech does not have a PhD in history. And so he didn't leave. He didn't go away. And the challenges of wanting an education, but not wanting to leave and not wanting to go very far away from home. This is really a powerful challenge that a lot of young people in Appalachia today deal with. At Radford, for example, a lot of students from Appalachia are in the education program, and they're in the nursing program because those are jobs that they can go back home and work at. So I'll end with the question that I started with. Why do we react so strongly to one place? And the simple answer is because it's where I'm from. And I'll say one last thing, that the people from Appalachia, they continue to feel that they belong where they are. And they do not feel like the place belongs to them, but rather that they belong to that place. So I'll just leave you with that thought. Done.
Thank you. So I want to take a minute to introduce Dr. Jeff Buckley, but before I do that, if you have access to your camera and would like to give Dr. Straw a round of applause with your sound off, you're welcome to do that. If you have the emoji, please feel free to do that as well. Now, Dr. Jeff Buckley, thank you. Dr. Jeff Buckley will be our discussion mediator. So we're about to transition into the question and answer session. And Dr. Jeff Buckley is an accomplished professor from the Department of Geography at Ohio University. He graduated with his doctorate from the Department of Geography, from the University of Maryland, and has held leadership and administrative appointments that feature national and international connections at Ohio University. Some of his recent publications include Mountains of Injustice, Environmental and Social Justice in Appalachia, a book publication, as well as articles such as stories about mountaintop removal in the Appalachian coal fields. This was presented in Mountains of Injustice, Social and Environmental Justice in Appalachia, the journal, as well as Living on the Fringe, a geographic profile of Appalachian Ohio, which was featured in Pittsburgh and the Appalachians, Cultural and Natural Resources in a Post-Industrial Age. Jeff, I'll now leave the discussion portion in your very capable hands. Thank you for being with us today.
Great, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. If someone just gives a thumbs up, then I'll, okay, I saw a thumb, great. So a couple of things that we could do here. One is if folks wanted to turn their cameras on, that way we could, if someone wanted to raise a hand, then they could unmute their microphone and ask Dr. Straw a question. Another option would be to use the chat tool, and you could type a question in, and when I see it in there, I can read that off. So while you are pondering this choice, okay, whether I want to turn the camera on or use the chat tool, I'm going to hog up the airwaves and ask the first question since I have that opportunity. And again, Dr. Straw, thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. I was just at the Athens History Center, and I think they have your book on sale there. My daughter has an AmeriCorps position there, so I'll have to pick that up. But there are a couple of things that you mentioned in there that lead up to this question. You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, for example, talking about this place, Appalachia, as one that has to change. And of course, talking about, I think attachment to place that a lot of residents have. And I'm curious about outside perceptions of the Appalachian region. And I wonder if you could comment a bit on Appalachia today and what, in your opinion, contributes to the persistence of cultural stereotypes. I teach in Appalachia a course as well, Appalachia Land and People, and we chat about cultural stereotypes. And so many students who are from Southeastern Ohio or they're from West Virginia, occasionally we'll get folks from Kentucky and Tennessee as well. They've had the experience where they've gone elsewhere, and whether it's an accent or just the mere knowledge that they're from the mountain east or the mountain south, they're immediately sort of cast into a particular category. So I'm curious if you could comment a little bit on what you think contributes to the persistence of these stereotypes. And as one person who went through that migration, and I think this is one of the things that Ron Eller talks about. One of the things that makes you Appalachian is that you leave the area, and you sort of have this experience. So I'm curious if you could talk about maybe your experience leaving the area and how that made you perhaps think differently about home and what contributes to the persistence of the stereotypes.
Well, I have to admit, I never really thought of myself as a person from Appalachia, to tell you the truth. My dad grew up on a farm in Western Ohio, and my mom grew up in Richmond, Indiana. So my linkages to the past were more Midwestern. although my mom always talked about Kentucky and her Kentucky cousins. So I did get some of that. I think my feeling about Appalachian stereotypes is that people continue to be influenced by ideas and images that are very, very, very old, and that they're not even aware that they're being influenced by. The idea of Appalachian isolation, for example, is a very persistent idea, and the idea that that people live back in these hollers, and that they're just they continue to be isolated from the mainstream of American life and American culture. I find those to still be ideas that that people talk a lot about. I can recall my mother-in-law visiting down here in southwestern Virginia one time, and we went somewhere, I don't know, we went somewhere to, I think we went up to this big resort on the top of this mountain close by. And I can remember her reaction was like, where do these people all work? Like, because we were driving in the rural area, and there's a house here, and then there's 2 miles away there's another house, and there's no visible farming really, and she couldn't understand why people would choose to live in a rural area and have to drive so far to go to work. And I think that represents an idea that people have that Appalachia is still a very isolated place. And I think some of these ideas about how people in Appalachia have resisted change, they've not been subject to the same forces of change that have affected people in the rest of the country. Some of the notions about the Scotch-Irish people being fiercely independent and violent and prone to settle problems, sort of man to man, and a kind of living outside the law. I mean, those themes are such a part of American literature in the late 19th century, and then they're incorporated into movies and cartoon strips. And I mean, the Little Abner cartoon strips in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and TV shows. It's just like almost any time anybody is depicted as a person from the mountains, or a hillbilly kind of character, it's done so without very much reflection at all. And so I think it just, those ideas just continue to be accepted. I mean, that's at least that's what I've, what I've seen about on that subject. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Would anyone like to turn their camera on and maybe raise their hand and ask a question?
I would.
Okay, great. Go for it.
So I guess I want to start out saying, like, when I was in high school and during the election in 2017, I think there was definitely a narrative of the people that are voting for Donald Trump are just everyone in the rural countryside. And I being in college, I've learned that that's not the case, and that I feel like they're often, people in Appalachia are often blamed for that. And my question is, I'm guessing how, as I'm a journalism student, so I guess as people who are in the media, how can we combat that stereotype? Yeah. Of Appalachian people being really conservative and racist.
Great question.
Just tell the truth. I mean, stereotypes, I was just talking about this, and I teach a class called Immigration History also. And coincidentally, yesterday we were talking about stereotypes of immigrants. And, it was an uncomfortable exercise, because I had the students name different immigrant groups, and then I had them tell me, well, what are the stereotypes of these people, right? Italians and Jews and Catholics. And Polish people, and I think any stereotype is perpetuated because people just they deal with generalities. They deal with groups. They deal with groups. They don't deal with individuals. And I don't know whether that's human nature or whatever. I mean, I'm the last person to comment on that. But it just seems to me like the way to combat a stereotype is to pay attention to what's really happening, what's really out there. And that was, I mean, that was an enormous part of the emergence of this institutionalized Appalachian studies, like this whole movement that spawned. I mean, the reason that Jeff teaches courses at OU with an Appalachian theme, is because in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a group of scholars got together, and actually, Jeff, a lot of these people that established the field of Appalachian studies, they were people from Appalachia that left and did other things and then came back. And a huge part of the motivation of that scholarship was to combat stereotypes. And whether it's worked or not, I'll let other people be the judge of that. But it's not for lack of trying that those stereotypes of Southerners or Southern mountain people still exist. I mean, I think they do for sure. I mean, journalists can use the word hillbilly, which is deeply offensive to some people, and they can use that word and not get canceled for it. It's the first time I've ever said that in a sentence.
Kennedy, if I could make a recommendation, it would be, especially now that all of us are probably watching a lot more on screens and so on. There's a terrific movie that came out 2 years ago called Hillbilly. And it's a filmmaker who grew up in Kentucky, moved to LA, and then came back to try to understand the 2016 election. And it's really fascinating. I think you might enjoy that. And another one to maybe precede that with is one called Strangers and Kin, which is an Appalachia film made down in Whitesburg, Kentucky. And it covers it's an older film, but it covers sort of this history of cultural stereotyping. And then Hillbilly is a really fascinating look at sort of the changing perceptions of the region.
As a plug, Hillbilly is a great reference, and I can put a link to that. But a lot of people are familiar with Hillbilly Elegy, but the book that responded to that was Appalachian Reckoning, which is a patchwork quilt of responses from all individuals within LGBT, different races, ethnicities, everybody that identifies as Appalachian but doesn't necessarily fit the stereotype, and then some that do. So if you're looking for multiple perspectives from a journalism standpoint, check out resources like that because they exist. They might not just get hypermedia. Now, Kira, I think you had a question as well.
Yep. Hi. So I was actually under the impression that Appalachia was like a county, like it was like one place in a state, which I was wrong about. It's like a whole region.
Oh, wait a minute. There's actually a town in Virginia called Appalachia.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
Throwing
about.
that out there. It's a little tiny old coal town.
Mm-hmm. So that's like halfway through your lecture, I realized that like you were mentioning Ohio and Athens, and I was like, oh, that's kind of bizarre. How long? But then I was like, oh, wait a minute. He's talking about like a broader spectrum. So I understand that now. But the question that I had sort of bounces off of Kennedy's, and I wanted to ask about, so you mentioned that Appalachia doesn't often change, like it's very grounded, and it's very, it sticks to its traditions. And so I wanted to ask you about what the racial acceptance progress is in most areas of Appalachia as of like current recent day, like right now.
Somebody knocked on my door right in the
Oh.
middle of your question. I'm sorry. Could you repeat it?
It's okay. I sort of, it was a little long-winded when I first said it, so I'll try to shorten it up this time. So I was wondering if you could elaborate like the current racial tension situation in Appalachia, like anywhere in Appalachia right now.
I don't really know. I'm not a very, I have to confess, I'm not a very astute observer of contemporary culture in Appalachia. If like I divide my time between studying images and characterizations of history in the South
Mm-hmm.
and in Appalachia. So I'm real tuned in to discussions about things like Confederate monuments and the way we remember the Civil War and that sort of thing. But as far as like the contemporary racial climate in Appalachia, I really don't think I could say very much intelligent about that.
Well, I'd like to hear about what you just said, the Confederate statues and Civil War things. I'd like to hear about that.
Well, that's a little off subject. I don't know. Ask Dr. Buckley if are there other more specific questions about Appalachia that people have?
I mean,
I will comment on. I will comment on one thing that Kira said, that I think you did characterize Appalachia in a really nice way there when you said that. I think you said this. It's a part of the country that has experienced dramatic changes in its history, just like the rest of the country has. But there is something that people in Appalachia value, and that is tradition, and they value family, and they value home, and they value place, and those are things that it's the way I like to think about it is that those are values that people have in Appalachia that were probably felt as strongly as they are felt today in Appalachia all over the country at one time or another. But it's just that the people in Appalachia have held on to some of these value structures that people in other parts of the country have let fall by the wayside. And I mean, I can talk personally about that, for example, like, and bounce that off of the point I made about young people in Appalachia who really struggle with the idea of going away to college, and maybe I'm going to have to get a job in Washington, D.C. or something like that, or Knoxville, and they really don't want to. To me, when I grew up, it was, unless I could have gotten a job teaching at OU, there was nothing that, there was no reason that I was going to hang around Athens. I mean, if I wanted to do what I wanted to do, I was going to have to move away, and I did, and my brothers did, and we didn't really ever give it a second thought. So there is that thread of tradition and the value of home and place in Appalachia that I think is missing from other parts of the country.
Thank you.
And that may actually contribute to some of the stereotyping also, because somebody that doesn't want to move away is going to be seen by somebody outside of Appalachia as maybe lazy or unambitious, rather than seeing the positive side of that. They want to stay close to their family. They value family. That's really important to them. So maybe they'll sacrifice something else in order to stay in an area close to their family. Whereas people in other parts of the country, they don't even think twice about that sort of thing. So
I will say too that the Appalachian Regional Commission link that I have posted, it has this map of subregions. It's also a good place to look for data on social, cultural information. I will also say that as somebody who researches the Appalachian region, I do so in part because there's not a lot of data out there specifically on the region. And so you and I'd be happy to talk to you more about it, but I think, yeah, Dr. Straw covered it well. I know Ryan had another question, and I know we're running out of time, and I see you too, Maria, so hopefully we get to both.
Thank you. I'll try to make mine quick. Dr. Straw, I live in Stark County, Ohio. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's right on the line of what's dictated as Appalachia. And my question to you is just, do you fear that...
Did you say Stark or Dark?
Stark.
Stark.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know where Stark County is. Okay.
Yeah. My question is, do you fear that Appalachia, especially among younger generations, is sort of losing its relevancy? Because I have tons of friends that, even though we live right on the border, none of us really know about it too well. And I know you had touched upon this earlier, making a statement of how it's sort of in a bubble. Do you fear that with future generations, especially younger generations coming up, that Appalachia's not on the map for them as much as it used to be for other people?
Well, that's a really good question, because, like, whatever Appalachia is, okay, whatever it is, if you could graph the awareness of and the interest in Appalachia by, let's say, the country as a whole, and you would find that there were times when there was a great deal of interest, and then it declines, and then you come along, and then there's another period of time where all of a sudden people are interested in this part of the country again, and then that goes away. So it's been the interest or the awareness of the rest of the country in Appalachia has been very cyclical. I mean, really, even going back into, I mean, I'm thinking like in terms of the first frontier idea, like as the front, the West. I mean, when those guys up there in Boston at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, as they thought about, coming out West, I mean, this is where they were talking about, right? And as the boundary moved, the region got more, people became more aware of it. And then they became aware of it because they thought it was this or that. So, unfortunately, most of, not all, but most of the outside focus on Appalachia has been for negative reasons. That's not always been the case, but it's been, even in times when people have been attracted to the region for positive reasons, some event will occur that'll sort of jar people into this, quote unquote, awareness of how weird and different, those people are. And, we got a lot of that in 2016. That book, Hillbilly Elegy, was responsible for all of that, for a lot of that. And, there wasn't that much new in that book. A lot of the stuff in that book it's just a rehash of what we used to call the culture of poverty theories. But anyway, that's a great question. And, I don't think it will, but it'll, like I said, it's up and then it's down, and then it's up and it's down, and people ignore the region, and then all of a sudden something happens and they focus on the region again. So it's a great question.
Great. We've also got a question from Kale. Is Kale still with us? And then another question from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. But is Kale around?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Oh.
So my name is Kale, and I'm actually a GA in the George Voinovich School of Leadership. My GA has tasked me with mapping the recovery system in Appalachia, Ohio. And just total transparency, I'm a person in long-term recovery. And I know that Appalachia has been devastated by the opiate crisis, probably more than any other region in the country. And getting back to your statement about this extended family on these properties, I spent time in Virginia, both while I was in the Navy and then afterwards in Roanoke and Salem area. And I found that to be very true. These big pieces of property with really nice houses, and then trailers, and then like shacks, right?
Mhm.
So what I found that to be true in Appalachia, Ohio as well. But what I've also found is that they're fiercely family loyal. So if somebody does have an opiate problem, the whole family's going to cover for them, right? So it's hard to get resources to the people that are actually suffering. And in fact, that's actually worse for the addict or the alcoholic. So my question is, how do I approach, I mean, I'm from Columbus, right? I'm not from Appalachia. I have a different accent, a different timbre in my voice, a different cadence in the way I talk. And I'm trying to like mimic, and I don't want to be authentic, but at the same time, I want to be able to get a bigger picture of where the resources are to do this map so it could be outward facing to the public. Does that make sense? So I guess my question is, how do I approach these people that are harboring addicts and alcoholics, right? How do we get to the people that are suffering? How do we get those resources to them? And how do I like break down those walls to be able to deliver resources to the people who actually need them? Gotcha. Sorry.
To say I have no idea. You know, you have to just, it's probably not that much different than other cultures. You just have to be able to talk to people and get their trust. I mean, you know, one of the things that I mean, if I can generalize over the time period that I'm interested in terms of Appalachia, I mean, Appalachian people don't like to be perceived as victims, you know, and there is, I think there still is an element of self-help and self-sufficiency, and we'll solve our own problems and take care of our own people, you know, and that, you know, that may be a rural tendency, but Appalachia is one of the most rural parts of the United States. So, you know, somehow you got to get into that. You got to get into that. You got to get people to trust you without them thinking that maybe, you know, you're there to like save them. Because right. Appalachian people have been saved many times, and, you know, they hate it. They're very resentful of those kinds of approaches.
And that's the reason why I tell people right from the start, like, I'm a person of long-term recovery, right? Because that tries to build the rapport.
That's your end. And, you know, just.
And that's the reason why I attended this, is because I wanted to have a better understanding of the Appalachian culture.
And to speak the lingo, you know. I mean, I'll tell you, it's a tough problem. My good friend, Steve Trout, who still lives in Athens, he was the director for about 20 years of a state, kind of a quasi-state organization called the Southern Consortium for Children. And they did mental health interventions for at-risk teenagers in the 7 Appalachian counties of Virginia, or of Ohio, I'm sorry. And you know, he had better Appalachian credentials than me. And he said that was their biggest problem, you know, was getting people to let them help their kids, you know. So it's a tough problem, and I applaud you for the, you know, the work that you're trying to do, because you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, it is a devastating problem in Appalachia, for sure.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.
Sorry I couldn't give you the magic word there, you know.
Do we have time for another
Just
question?
going up on your country music, and that's
Richard, do we have time for another question?
about hunting or something. I've got nothing. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing anybody shake their heads wildly. So
I'll stay. I'm fine.
okay, good. So we do have a question or two here. I also wanted to make a pitch very briefly here for, I did write down in the chat section, for those who are interested in race and ethnicity. Crystal Wilkinson gave a talk here at the library last year. She's part of a group of Appalachian poets along with Frank X. Walker. And so I think that might be a really good source for trying to understand African American and white relations. So she did a reading from her, I think she just wrote her first novel. That might be a good source. But the question
Yeah, is that girl that asked the woman that asked the question about race? I wonder if she's still on, because that, yeah, I hadn't thought about the because we have a woman here who's very involved in that Appalachian poetry.
Yeah, I don't see her, but hopefully we could get that information back to her. But
Kennedy Raspberry is what it said on her.
Yeah, well, there's Kennedy, and then there was also Kira. So, and I think they'd both be interested in that. But our next question was, let's see, we had, is there any history behind the origin of the term Appalachia? Are there influences of Native Americans and indigenous peoples who inhabited southeastern Ohio or the Appalachian region?
Yeah, I think that name, I used to know this, but the name, the word Appalachia does have some Native American, it does have a Native American origin, but I couldn't tell you what it was without looking it up. I mean, I could probably look it up. I don't think that would be hard to, you could just Google that.
And, you know, and I think, you know, one of the things that I guess related to that, I was just curious. I mean, one of the most obvious sort of indications of Native Americans in the Athens area has been the Indian mounds. And there are a couple of remnants in the plains. But I was curious, when you were growing up, I've always heard that there were more mounds around here, but they sort of got leveled by developers. But back in the 60s, 70s, were they more prevalent in the Athens area?
I honestly don't know. I know about the one, the prominent one at the Plains was really the only one that I was aware of growing up. There may have been more out there, but that was the main one that I know of. I'm not aware of any others particularly that were destroyed, but that you know, there could be. I don't know. Okay.
And Richard, our last question that I see here is, how has the African American influence showed up in the history and culture of Appalachia?
Oh, it's been huge. You know, mostly I have a student now working on a senior capstone project about Blacks in Appalachia. And, you know, there were enslaved people in all of the counties of all of the South. There were the percentages of enslaved people in Appalachia was smaller than in other parts of the South, and that some of those issues, some of that is connected to the fact that there was a substantial amount of unionist sentiment in Appalachia during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, as the railroads developed, the more railroad construction, the iron industry really took off, and the coal mining industry really took off. There are large numbers of Blacks that moved into the coal towns. And most of the books about the coal industry in the late 19th century, early 20th century, deal with Black workers, Black coal miners. Right around Athens, there was a very prominent Black coal miner who was a leader in the early UMW named Richard Davis, and Herbert Gutman wrote about him, and so it's you know, it's prominent mostly in relationship to the construction industry and the railroad industry and the coal industry, but substantial numbers of Blacks. You know, the movie Matewan has an interesting scene where they talk about the three groups of people in the coal towns, the mountain people, and then the European immigrants and the African Americans, and how the coal owners, the operators they did everything they could to keep those three groups of people separate, playing on racial stereotypes and, playing on racism and prejudice and nativism, so that those three groups of people wouldn't get together. And there's a great deal of truth to that.
Great. Those two questions were from Monique and Maria. We have two last questions, and one of them is from Gigi. So I think we better address that one. So if you can hang on, they're provocative questions, I think, especially the second one, which deals with Confederacy and the Confederate flags. But before we get to that one, the question, oh, I'm sorry, it's not from Gigi, it's from Gina. And she writes, what do you think is the reason for the clannishness in Appalachia, being of Scottish, Irish descent?
I assume she means clannish with a C?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that's just not part of the stereotype of people in Appalachia. I mean, you can go from, there's a lot of stereotypes of Scotch-Irish people. Clannishness may be one of those things. I mean, I prefer to talk about, family loyalty, which I guess is probably the same thing. And I think that, the way I would describe that historically would be to talk about initial settlement patterns, because the settlement patterns in Appalachia, white people started flowing in to the Shenandoah Valley and then down the Valley of Virginia in the mid 18th century, and then a little bit later, people are coming down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, from the confluence up there, and spreading down into West Virginia and up into Ohio. And the settlement patterns were that the large valleys were settled first, and then as the better land in those areas was filled up, people start moving up the rivers and the creeks and the hollers, and then eventually they're up on the ridge tops. But as people moved, they tended to settle not far away from other family members. So the general demographic feature of Appalachian settlement in the period from about 1740 to about 1820 was these extended family settlements. That the nuclear family was the norm, but very close by would be, sons and daughters and their families and granny, and and so as people grow up and move out, they want their own land, but they don't want to be that far away from the center of their family or the leaders of their family. And so you have these extended family communities, and you might have a community up a holler where there might be 7 or 10 families represented, and 3 or 4 or 500 people that are all interconnected with those 7 or 10 people. So to me, it's just a matter of, it's kind of a logical pattern of settlement in an area where it was beneficial for people to be close together and not going way the heck away and trying to live on your own out in the woods somewhere.
Great, thank you, Richard. We have one last question here before we wrap up. I think it's probably a simple answer to this question. I find that many people in Appalachia sympathize with the Confederacy and South. So no, it's not going to be a simple response. Even people in Ohio fly rebel flags. I thought Appalachia was more for the Union, and wonder if there was any insight to offer for this shift.
Well, I could say a couple of things about that. One is that a unionist sentiment was very strong in the Appalachian area in the Civil War period of time. But unionist sentiment isn't necessarily the same thing as being anti-slavery. And I think that's something to keep that's really important about Appalachian history. West Virginia, for example, seceded from Virginia in 1861, but was not granted admission to the Union until 1863, because the first two constitutions that the state of West Virginia submitted to Congress did not abolish slavery. So the Unionist sentiment in Appalachia didn't necessarily mean that they were anti-slavery. And you know, and sadly, unfortunately, I mean, racism has been a part of life in Appalachia, just like it has been all over the country. You know, there are these so-called sundowner towns in Appalachia, where you weren't, if you were Black, you weren't supposed to be there after the sun went down. And there's been documentation of that history. So it's, you know, it's an ugly racist past for sure. The Confederate flag, though, I mean, I'm fascinated by that symbol, actually, and I've done research on Lexington, Virginia, which has had a very troubled past over the last 10 years or so about how they're supposed to remember the Civil War. And I've collected photographs of contemporary pictures that I've taken of Confederate symbols and the Confederate flag, you know, everything from huge flags growing in people's yard or flying in people's yards to, you know, decals on cars. And, you know, I have pictures of fancy cowboy boots festooned with the Confederate flag. But I also have, and I show these in I teach a public history class also, and I spend a lot of time talking about images of history and how they, you know, how they resonate with people. And I have a photograph of a soccer match in Greece where fans are flying the Confederate flag. I've photographs of outlaw biker groups in Sweden flying the Confederate flag. So to some extent, that flag has become to represent, has come to represent for a lot of people a kind of just defiance of authority in any measure. Just a kind of, you know, sort of in your face, you know, flipping the bird to society kind of thing. And it represents that to a lot of people. It also represents a lot of ignorance, unfortunately, I think, among people who fly that flag and who claim the, you know, heritage, not hate argument, which you see a lot in Virginia, which is just, you know, I'll apologize if I'm offending anybody, but it's just the product of just ignorance, to not associate that symbol with hate is just pure ignorance. So, you know, that's my answer to that question.
Great, thank you so much. Claire, do you want to say anything to wrap up?
I'm actually going to pass the mic over to Gigi since her mic wasn't working earlier. So thank you all and welcome, Dr. Sakubin.
Thank you all so much, and I apologize for the earlier technical issue. The computer audio and visual went out at the same time, just as you all were starting. So thank you for the flexibility. And I want to say thank you to Dr. Straw and Dr. Buckley and Claire as well for moderating the discussion today. I think it was a really eye-opening discussion for many of us. And I'll share too that this is today's event is part of our monthly diversity and inclusion speaker series. And what we hope to do through the series is elevate diverse voices and discussions around current issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so as part of that series, many of you may have remembered we welcomed Sharon Cooper, who's the sister of the late Sandra Bland, who shared with us her enduring vision of racial justice. And I want to be able to plug next month's program, when we will continue by hosting an event in coordination with 23andMe that explores the history of slavery from a genetic lens. So I did want to say the inspiration for bringing Dr. Straw as part of today's presentation was, of course, our Appalachian students who are part of OMSAR and are part of the Appalachian Scholars Program, which is prestigious merit and need-based scholarship program for high school graduates who reside in one of the 32 Appalachian counties of Ohio. And I want to thank Dr. Straw again. Again, as he plugged his book earlier, my initial inspiration for this was, as I mentioned, our students, but also the book, and I found it in our local CVS as part of a series of pictorial histories on the region. So I know that he got many of these photos in the book from the Athens County Historical Society Museum, and also it's now known as the Southeast Ohio History Center. So thank you all again for taking the time. And Chris mentioned earlier, if there are some of you that would like to stay on, I see that there are a number of folks still on the call. So if you have some additional questions, I know Dr. Straw is willing to stay for a little bit longer, and we hope to see you all next month again. So thank you all so much for coming today.